articles coming out of the perspective approach were published in Population and Development Review. And I was also lucky enough to be part of some very early discussions of the ideas with Warren Sanderson at IIASA. I will give a brief introduction. I'll keep it to 5 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'll lay out, we'll get into it. Before I lay out a little bit about how we see this session developing, I want to tell you a cautionary tale about policymaking in the area of population and individual aging. I draw this from Anthony Trollope's last novel, which was called The Fixed Period, published in 1882 when he was 67 and within a few months of his death. It's a satiric novel. There is a new island republic. It is cast off the shackles of British colonialism, and the young and enthusiastic population is considering their future. One of the policy problems to be addressed is what to do about the aging population. So many of the themes mentioned here are examined. There are quantitative analyses. First of all, there's a discussion of what's old. And it's determined that 67 is the breaking point between young and old. There are estimates of the dependency ratio, percentage over 67, percentage under 67, that are children and those that are over 15. And the production and consumption of the young and old are estimated. Obviously, the older are drain on the collective purse, and the implications for saving and investment in this closed economy are considered. There are public consultations and parliamentary debates and whatnot. I suspect we're well ahead. This is all 100 years in the future, so this is happening in 1980. I suspect we're well ahead already. The decision is made that there will be gradually phased in a program of euthanasia at the age of 67. Or rather 68, because old people will be supported in blissful retirement for 1 year, and then they will be, so to speak, escorted out. I won't go into the entire novel, but there's a happy ending. The denouement is when a British gunboat shows up and deposes the government, and so British imperialism intervenes again, and all is happy. A story of policy pitfalls. Policy is not informed by the things we've heard here. Now, I want to hope that we can stick to the theme of the conference, which is research and policy. We've got a very broad set of participants here, an unusually broad set of participants. And we've got the research community, policy community, a number of people have feet in both camps, of course, and we also have the press. So I also hope in looking at the thing of policy and research, that we can concentrate on the contribution of these new and alternative measures. I think we can agree that we've heard credible argument that they are scientifically superior to traditional measures, although I can guarantee you that there will be some opposition to them. But also they must be embedded in the political economy context of population and people aging. Political economy means incentives, it means trade-offs, it means power relations, values, political will, it means expectations, it means just heard. So it's a policy minefield. These are statistical measures and statistical indices, and there's no such thing as an apolitical index. We've got an excellent panel here. We're going to start off with a presentation from Stuart Gietel-Basten from Hong Kong Science and Technology, 15 minutes, then 5 minutes of useful interventions from our panel, which is consisting of Mr. Pasali from UNDESA, Ms. Castillo from Philippine Statistics Authority, then Warren Lutz, and then Stuart, if you feel you've been ill-used, you can make a brief reply, otherwise we'll just turn the thing over for the session.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Landis is much more sophisticated than I am. I don't really know about 19th century literature. I just put up funny pictures and graphs and talk awkwardly because that's just who I am. So here we are. It's all really miserable, really grim, silver tsunami, awful, patronising. You know, nothing we can do about it. This miserable state of affairs that we are presented with, and you know, the way of thinking about this is that we're drowning under this sea of ageing. And the worst of all, it's all these kids' faults for not having enough kids, not dating, and things like this. It's all a very kind of toxic, pretty mean, spirited way of looking at this. And of course, here we are. We see this in our sleep. This is just for some emerging markets. And you know, the dependency ratios, they do kind of look like a big wave. You know, they do go up and up and up as we go into the future. But of course, it doesn't have to be like this. You know, there are alternatives. There are better, certainly I would say better, but certainly alternative ways to measure and consider ageing, whether or not we think about national, all the things we've been talking about, whether it's national transfers, pension and worker ratio, economic dependency ratio, we've said about employment dependency ratios, prospective measures, Sergey and Warren's work as with others. But then we can also think beyond measures to different paradigms, different alternative ways of just conceptualising the notion of population aging, about demographic metabolism. Populations are not just getting older, but they're getting richer and healthier and more educated and so on and so forth. Whether we think about compression of morbidity, it's not really a paradigm, but it's really more of a kind of an overarching concept. What are we really worried about when we talk about population aging? And this is often not very well defined. And of course the idea of second demographic dividend. But the problem is when we look at these alternative measures, these different measures of population aging, there's always a kind of a trade-off that we need to do. And whether or not we want to go into depth and really understand what's going on in one country, or we actually have to operate at a high level abstraction so we can actually make decent comparisons between places. Whether or not we are looking retrospectively at where we are today, or about how we go into the future. How easy it is to interpret these things. If I have a journalist call me up who wants to ask a question about ageing, and I've got to explain the notion of intergenerational transfers in the National Transfer Account framework, well, I'm lost. You know, I can't have that conversation. It's very difficult. And so when we also have to think about the different feedbacks and dimensions that we see. And there's also an idea of, well, what can you actually do with these things? I talk about prospective or dependency ratio and prospective measures, but whenever I talk about it, it always seems to be deliberately misinterpreted. Oh my God, we've got to retire at 75. No, that's not what we're trying to say. But this is this kind of misinterpretation that we often see, and people often say, well, this is very nice, that's very positive, but okay, it's kind of hypothetical, it's kind of theoretical, what can we do with that information? Similarly about NTAs, they tell us a lot about where we are now and how we've got here, but what about the future? You know, modelling NTAs into the future is a little bit difficult. And similarly, the idea of thinking about pensioner-worker ratios is extraordinarily complicated. Econometric modelling will go into how sustainable a pension system is. So just thinking about, oh, these are people who are paying in and these are people who are receiving. It's not really a very kind of adequate way of conceptualising. Some of my economist colleagues, because they're friends, colleagues in the university, they can't believe that we think in this extremely simplistic paradigm. But it also seems that there's something of a tension, even in the way, even just in the last 2 days, I think, how sometimes we can appear to be talking across each other, I think, in terms of like our measurements. So demographers, we're about measuring things and estimating and doing forecasting demand. But there are other stakeholders who almost have a kind of a different motivation, which is about creating a better future, aspiring for a different future. It's about measuring. Demography is quite like a better future as well, but that's not necessarily our starting point to this. And in fact, when we think about, so we're thinking retrospectively and making forecasts, but of course, many other stakeholders or policymakers are thinking in a different way. There might be a theory of change approach. So this is where we want to be in the future. Right? This is our end goal, this is our end point, and how can we design and define policies to actually get there. And of course, you know, I don't work for the UN, but so I can talk about SDGs as well. This is another notion of, well, this is where we've signed up to be in X years' time, and that we've got to do all these different things to get there. But that's a different thing to the kinds of things that we're producing, and the estimates that we're producing, I think, as demographers, very often. So is it possible to reconcile all of these different things, these different motivations, you know? The reason why this notion of a silver tsunami prevails is because it's kind of intuitive, right? And it's very easy to sell. A graph where everything goes up or goes down, basically that goes the way you don't want it to go, is very easy to sell. And quite frankly, if you're looking for research money, that's what you say. You say the problem's really, really big. So I need a big grant to try to solve this and fix it. Right? And it sells newspapers. It does sell newspapers. Despite the fact it is fundamentally accurate, right? But that's not the point, right? Whereas our new measures, I think they're more dynamic, they're more positive, they're more realistic, but actually quite hard to explain. They're quite hard to operationalise and translate directly into a kind of policy setting. Whereas this other approach, this kind of end-point approach, how do we get there? Whether or not this can be universally applicable, and of course data is still in there as baseline and as M&E going forward. But you know, we're not necessarily putting all of those different things together. So I guess this comes to a fundamental question about what do we actually want these measures for? What is the point? It's a very existential moment here, but what's the point of all this? Right? Why are we creating these projections? Why are we creating these measures and these numbers? Is it to actually properly estimate and guess what demand for particular services are? Or is it actually just to kind of frighten us? You know, is it to give us some notion, oh look, this thing is going to happen, and we need to change course, we need to do things differently. Our business as usual approach won't actually work. I often use this example here from Singapore. This is the projections of births in 1970 in Singapore and the reality. Because the idea that your first instinct is, oh, wow, they got it completely wrong. This was a disaster, terrible. But of course, the reality came about because they didn't want this number to occur. So the projection became an active agent in changing the future. Right? That's how we need to think about this, conceptualize. But the problem is when we think in this two-dimensional way about this is our one-dimensional measure of aging or whatever it is, then we can often think in this kind of closed-loop manner, right? That in this unidimensional way. So we have demographic problems, low fertility. Population aging is caused by low fertility, and so they can solve this within the loop by increasing fertility or whatever. And of course, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a very clear and rational way to solve this problem. Because the reality is, as we might say in applied systems analysis, controversially, is that we are these population systems are extraordinarily complex and dynamic. So yes, the population is changing, maybe getting older, maybe getting younger, but in and of itself that doesn't mean anything unless it's linked to an institution. That's why I said about being 65. Being 65 doesn't mean anything unless it's the age at which some benefit occurs, or you can get a pension or whatever. But at the same time, we have these characteristics. They're also changing as well. So rather than just kind of young and old, we have to think in this very complex systems way. Now I'm not going to go through this here, but this is just to show you, just from the top of my head, all the different dynamics and different changes which are going on in the case of China. If you want to think about aging in China and the aging challenge in China, then you might say, well, actually we're not going to bother about babies or older people, we're just thinking about productivity. Well, if we have massive productivity gains, then part of this problem may go away. We think about characteristics in demographic metabolism. The Chinese population is richer and healthier, and more skilled and more adaptable than it's ever been. But the pessimistic view is based purely upon a two-dimensional approach. So I think, therefore, when we have these measures, and the way that we communicate them, we've got a bit of a fundamental problem because we're using relatively static, independent measures. Right? So we're either trying to measure all of aging on a macro composite level or individual aspects. But the reality is, of course, is that these are dynamic, interdependent issues. So even though prospective aging dependency ratio is more dynamic, it takes into account dynamic changes in life expectancy, for example, it's still relatively static in the sense of, for example, fixing remaining life expectancy at 15 years. There's still there's a static component there. So what I'm saying is that we have these variable outcomes, and then once we take into account uncertainty, either over time or across space, and feedback effect, then it becomes very difficult for us to actually really truly conceptualize and measure what the issues are and what the problem of aging might be. So when we might think about a way forward, I worry sometimes that the measures that we produce can lead to a kind of a false conclusion. It's like, well, we've got to do X because the forecasts say this. So then that just means the forecasts come true because we become a slave to the forecast. We do what the forecasts have said we have to do. But then on the other hand, this future-oriented view is, well, I don't really care about the forecast, I just want to be there. I want this thing to happen. And so we design some kind of way of getting there. But the reality is, of course, is that it's a bit more complicated than that. I think we can do slightly better than this. You know, we can have different measures for different people. In some cases, at some times, just saying this is the old age dependency ratio, that's the only message you're going to be able to communicate. Right? And that may be good enough in some cases. But then, with different people with different needs, if you talk about the old age dependency ratio to an actuary, they'll just laugh in your face, right? So we have to think slightly more holistically about these different messages. And therefore, we have a need to be both reactive, the need for reactive policies and proactive policies. Right? So we need to know the demand for particular kinds of services, but then at the same time, we need to, it doesn't mean that we can't design the kind of future that we would like. So therefore, you know, there's two ways that we can either get in a panic and say, oh, it's all really complicated, it's not possible to do anything about this. Or we could embrace this uncertainty and embrace this interdependence and actually maybe think about scenarios or shared socioeconomic pathways as different kinds of futures that we might want, rather than say just a fixed thing that, well, we've got to meet SDG 6.1 or whatever it is. We could just have these alternative scenarios, which are realistic, qualitative scenarios with a kind of quantitative underpinning. And we can translate these, as I said, we can translate these qualitative storylines into a quantitative measure. And some of these scenarios will be more favourable than others. So therefore, they're not really concluding a half conclusion, is to say that all of these different measurements that we're coming up with, there will be different needs for different people, right? Different measurements that are appropriate in different settings. But we also need to remember that there is a need in Hong Kong. I will be asked about the demand for institutional care settings in 5 years' time. Well, that's a kind of a forecast that you can make on existing data, but that's very specific and very precise. As soon as that becomes comparative, then we have a bit of a problem. But with all of this uncertainty, I hate to really want to kind of quote Dick Cheney in these moments, but you know, when we have known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, etc., but we can build that uncertainty in. We don't need to be frightened about this, that we can actually make this more proactive kind of future where we embrace uncertainty and interdependence. And I think that scenarios can possibly be a helpful midway. The alternative, if that's too messy and too complicated, is that we don't measure aging at all. We just think it's just a number that doesn't really mean anything. And that maps on to political reality. In very few places is there a Ministry of Aging. Right? We are talking kind of across different departments and measuring something which is in some ways a very kind of woolly, cloudy concept that is quite difficult to pin down to a kind of a target source. So if we're worried about pensions, then let's just model pensions. Right? If we're concerned about dementia and dementia care in the future, then let's just forget about the number of babies or the number of migrants or the number of 63.5-year-olds, and we'll just model that. Or alternatively, do we mainstream aging? Right? We've got all these different measurements in everything else, and what we need to do is actually mainstream into that. Not just aging, but like you say, changing population structure. Right? So it's not just about being old or young, but it would be the different population structures that we have. I mean, I often think of in Hong Kong, for example, we talk about walkability and accessibility and things, but this is not related to age. It's nothing to do with age. This is going to be a universal factor for everybody. But anyway, there we are. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Or you want to take 5 minutes or so to comment on what you heard?
The story I have to tell has to do with something that was just said by the chief economist of the Bank of Japan. This was at a summer meeting of G20 leaders, and it was last month. And the notes were just published 5 days ago. So if you're a journalist and you want to say something about demography that is recent, here it is, 5 days old. And here's what Mr. Sakine said. I'm going to read it to you, and then this is an economics language. I need to translate it into English, but first I will read it. So he said that Japan was at the forefront of population aging in a chronological sense, and this had lowered potential growth in the natural rate of interest. He then pointed out that Japan might not be aging in a biological sense, that the difference between biological and chronological ages had widened substantially. For instance, 65-year-olds in 1970, in terms of a mortality rate of 2.3%, was equivalent to 77-year-olds in 2016. Sakine argued that demography might not matter in itself, and that what really matters was institutional setups that did not accord well with demographic changes. Institutional setups for labor markets and social security systems that were tied to chronological ages would have an adverse effect on the economy as stickiness in nominal wages and prices did. Now let me tell you what he said. Now let me translate this. You notice we have 65-year-olds and 77-year-olds. 77-year-olds are the new 65-year-olds. This is what Sergey showed us. These are constant characteristic ages, and here we have the chief economist of the Bank of Japan talking in our language of constant characteristic ages. The characteristic here is mortality rates. And Sergey and I have done work involving many characteristics, including the mortality rate. But now, what he said at the beginning was Japan, in terms of aging, had lowered its rate of economic growth. But later on, you notice he says, but demography might not matter at all. It might not matter at all if you adjust the institutions according to constant characteristic ages. But if the institutions get us into a situation where we fix the ages in a world where things change, the system could break. Economic growth can suffer. So that is an example where our new way of thinking about aging is factored into policy. It's the head chief economist of the Bank of Japan saying that. So I have a recommendation. So maybe we could get the news people interested in something like chief economist of the Bank of Japan uses new measures of aging to say that demography might not matter in itself. I sort of like the concept of sticky wages. I would say perhaps sticky ages are as important to the macroeconomy as sticky wages were to the Japanese economy some years previously. But you know, it's hard to get the attention of journalists. It's no longer possible to discuss population aging using only conventional measures. The UN now offers us a choice of conventional measures and new measures. And when we talk to policymakers, we talk among ourselves, we have to make a choice. We may make a choice of the old way or the new way. So the question is, how do we get policymakers, how do we get the media to take notice of the fact that we have to make a choice? So I thought this is one possible headline. UN gives policymakers a choice of approaches to measurement of population aging. Expert group meeting ends in bloody brawl over which approach to use. But of course that's not true. But what is true is we now have a choice. There's more than one way to look at population aging, and we cannot any longer ignore this choice. It is here, it is in front of us, and we have to make it when we talk about population aging. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Castillo?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the Philippine Statistics Authority, and our work mainly is more on the data support for policy use, and conduct national surveys to support policy. So on the presentation earlier, I think I cannot comment much on that. What I have prepared actually is more of the policies and program initiatives of the Philippines based on its current situation on its population. So if I may, then I would like to present to you what I have prepared.
Oops, sorry.
Okay, for the outline of my presentation, so I'm going to talk about the population aging in the country, in the Philippines, discussing the demographic trends and prospects, and then the Filipino older persons' well-being, caring for the Filipino older persons, policy support and program initiatives, and responding to the needs of the aging societies. I hope you will still find this presentation helpful. Okay, on the population aging in the country. So these are the sources of data I used on aging. So we have the Philippine Census of Population and Housing, the Philippine Life Tables, and then there are two surveys. One is done in 1996 and the other one done in 2007, both on the elderly. The first one is called Philippine Elderly Survey, and then the one done in 2007 is Philippine Study on Aging, and then other various studies on aging. And then there are two prospective data sources that can be used in analyzing aging. One is the 2016 National Disability Prevalence Survey. This is still, the results are not yet out. We're still doing the analysis. and then a research, a longitudinal study on aging, and this is still being undertaken. These are prospective. The last two are prospective data sources. So I have two questions here to be answered. Is the Philippine population aging? Are older Filipinos living longer and getting healthier? In our discussion since yesterday, we have there a 60 years old as our cut-off age for old. And based on UNDESA population division, they have a document there that is used for classifying different societies. The first one is the young society. That is when the population of 60 and older is less than 10% of the population. And then for aging societies, for 10 to 19%, the 60 years old and above comprise 10 to 19%. High aging for 20 to 29%, and the hyper-aging society for older people comprising 30% of the population. There's another classification by the Asia Health and Well-being Initiative. Instead of 60 as the cut-off age, they have 65 years old. And their nomenclature is, the first one is young society, the aging society, the aged society, and super age. Based on the 2015 census of population, Philippines has a total population of 100.98 million, and 7.5% of this population are 60 years old and over, while 4.7% are 65 and over. That portion, that yellow portion there in the graph, corresponds to the population 60 and above. I superimposed the population structure of Japan with that of the Philippines. The Philippines is the colored one, the blue and the red, and then the Japan there. Japan being a super age society with around 30% of its population already in their 60s. The older population is the fastest growing population sector with a trend expected to hold in the future. It is that topmost line there. So the increasing population growth rate of older persons is also due to the changing age structure resulting from fertility decline. The demographic phenomenon can be attributed to the gains in the life expectancy, largely due to the improvements in child mortality as well as changing age structure due to fertility decline. The table shows the improvement in the life expectancy at birth and at age 60 based on the 1970 Philippine life tables and the 2010 life tables. So on the second question, are older Filipinos living longer and getting healthier? So there's increasing life expectancy at age 60, which suggests the improving longevity of older Filipinos. But female older persons live longer, but they spend a greater part of their remaining life in inactive state relative to the males. Functional health is improving over time. And then there's, based on the 2010 census, 19% of older Filipinos have at least one ADL difficulty. Younger cohorts of older persons have better health status. There are major gaps and significant differentials in the health status of the older persons. And these are access to health insurance coverage remains low, particularly among the females and the older cohorts. on oral health, low number of remaining teeth. In Japan, they have the motto which is 20 at 80, which means that they have 20 remaining teeth at age 80. So for the Philippines, only 6% of those persons aged 80 and above have at least 20 remaining teeth. And then there is a net need for health services, which remains substantial. Significantly better self-assessed health status among the younger cohorts and those better educated. Filipino older persons' major concerns on well-being is not only on health, but also on economic concerns. So I was warned that my time is up.
So, why don't you just finish up?
Okay. So for the economic concerns, older Filipinos have low income and assets, with many of them, specifically women, depending on their children for economic support. And you would see here on this graph that over half of Filipino older people, age 60 and older, receive no form of pension at all. This is this red or orange line there. So more than half will not have pension. Now, for the policy support and program initiatives of the government in caring for the Filipino, for the older persons. So, the tradition of caring for the old still lingers in the Filipino families. Older Filipinos enjoy a significant amount of care and support from their spouse and children. Family support comes from financial support and other financial transfers, financial and non-financial transfers. Significant amount of support in terms of companionship and assistance. Caring for the older persons by the family and the state is similarly emphasized in all household principles. So the policies of the government, one is it has designed a long-term care program strategies to respond to the need of older persons for care and support. There is home care support service for senior citizens, and then there is residential care service, which is a 24-hour facility that provides long-term temporary care. Outside the country, Philippines also respond to the needs of aging society by responding to the demand for healthcare workers. The Philippines has become one of the major source countries of domestic care and healthcare workers. So for the past 5 years, the country has consistently sent health and care workers to the Middle East, America, Asia, and European countries. Philippines is one of the major source countries of domestic care and healthcare workers. Prior to migration, the leading profession among Filipino immigrants is professional nurses. Philippines is one of the major source countries of domestic care and healthcare workers. Over the 5-year period, health and care workers, professional nurses, and caregivers are among the top skills deployed by the Philippines. And the Filipino health and care workforce, towards a competitive health care workers in view of local office employment, the government has strengthened education and training, these different areas.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so confronting the cross-border movement of Filipino health and care workers, we face challenge. The confronting paradox is the increasing out-migration of Filipino health and care workers vis-a-vis the rapid rate of growth of older segments in the population. There's also brain drain and brain gain and the prospect of brain inflation and the strengthening of current measures on integration for return overseas.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Pasali.
Okay, we'll go with you. Okay, thank you very much. for the organizers for inviting me. I'll just give a quick overview, a few results from Africa with respect to aging. It was mentioned by Razak earlier that it's the most beautiful continent in the world, but aging in absolute numbers is increasing rapidly there also. However, the issue is only a matter of concern in the small island states, countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Cabo Verde. The rest of Africa, as I'll show you some results from the MIPA review, it's not really on the agenda. So when we look at the review of Madrid International Action on Aging, you have data from 31 African countries. Only 17 of them have developed comprehensive and standalone national plans, policies, or strategies to tackle the issue. And when you look at those 17, almost none of them have integrated budgetary implications. So they're just, plans and policies. The government is not really allocating any resources into it, not financial, not human. As I said earlier, Mauritius is by far the most successful country in Africa addressing the issue. They have the universal non-contributory pension system since 1958, and you don't have to be a citizen, you need to be a resident. And they have a university for the elderly. It's not like elderly gets degrees there, but they're connected to the youth, and they're teaching things to the youth, and they're learning ICT-related stuff from the youth. So 17 had the policies, but 23 out of 31 report major challenges in implementation of formulated policies. And I want to stress this because one of the critical issues here is bridging the research with policy. So that's where the issue comes up in formulating specific programs to address the issue. So they usually say that operationalizing the policies proved to be very difficult in the absence of data to guide programmatic action. So, evidence-based policy making requires data, but data, in Africa we use DHS a lot, but DHS unfortunately cuts off at 49. So how to tackle these challenges? Well, there's something that's happening recently in Africa, and it's the digital ID, digital national ID. I mean, data is missing. And with the SDGs, we're trying to get more and more access to administrative data. And one way of, the whole idea with the SDGs is that we should leave no one behind. But unfortunately, elderly is the easiest group of leaving behind, especially because of lack of data. And SDG 16.9 clearly says that there should be legal identity for all. So digitizing the process is not really it is a costly thing, but all African countries are holding elections, and UNDP is supporting them with quite a bit of cash to do the national registries. So that could be the starting point of digitizing the process of providing legal identity to all. And that's the first starting point for service delivery, if you think about it, for elderly, for pension, for social protection. We need to first identify who they are, how many they are, and where they are. This is much more efficient, and it doesn't, there's no trade-off with equity, and it's a human right. So there's some interesting things happening in countries like Namibia and Botswana, and there's also substantial improvement in Africa with regards to civil registries and vital statistics, which can actually update the national registry program. So the idea is really to come up with the national registry and identify all those people in your population, all segments, especially the elderly group. So I'm from the Economic Commission for Africa. I work on gender equality. So when I wanted to, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the gender gap. But at one point, when you know that majority in the life expectancy of women being higher than men, it becomes a bit difficult to talk about gender equality or gender issues because there's not enough men there, and it's more of a woman's issue. It becomes more of a woman's issue. But I think that when you talk about prospective age, there's really a good connection there, and I think UN Women would really like this idea, because there you're not comparing women and men of the same age group, but you're actually comparing women and men with the same life expectancy or remaining years of life. So women live longer than men in Africa with an ever-increasing gender gap. We looked at 54, there are 54 countries in the continent, and 43 of them, the gap is widening over time. And in 10 countries only, there's a decreasing trend, but these are the countries where the gap is already very high. So they're decreasing because they start with a larger gap. And there are some important implications on gender equality here. First of all, women overall spend more time with their children and grandchildren, and there's some evidence that they have more incentives to invest in their children and grandchildren because they're living with them more. But living with your children and grandchildren come at a cost also, particularly time poverty and health problems, and this is impacting obviously the productive capacity of elderly women, who are critical in Africa for food security, by the way. They're in agriculture and they're contributing to food security. So they're involved in patient care, and they get sick out of this patient care also, and they're also taking care of the HIV/AIDS patients, some of which are their grandchildren. So in Zimbabwe and Namibia, for example, out of 60% of the orphan children live in households that are headed by their grandparents. So that's a huge cost that needs to be valued and acknowledged, obviously. And in some countries, they are acknowledged, actually. So there's support, I think, in South Africa, in some of the southern African countries. And finally, the risk of disability is increasing along with other health problems, while there's not really much going on in geriatric medicine in Africa. So 8 out of 31 countries have public geriatric training programs. So, you know, there's not much happening there for future, and they're trying to collaborate with one another. There's certain, we didn't talk much about cancer at old age, but cervical cancer, which is identified highly in old age women group, for example, it's a curable cancer, but if you don't know, if you're not screening, particularly in rural areas, we are missing it. In Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, the cervical cancer has increased substantially, but we're not sure about the age segregation of this. And if it is screened, if it is known, we can actually cure it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. As you heard at the beginning of the conference, very much, not only at the UN level, but really globally, is currently being framed in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think for good reasons. And as I happen to be myself on a team of people charged with the production of the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, I'm almost on a daily basis now working on text that we can present to the heads of state and government at the UN General Assembly this fall. I take benefit from some of the experience I have in other fields in the field of climate change research to draw some parallelities to the 80s. Both of these issues are considered global megatrends. That they often come up at number 1, 2, or sometimes 3 with technological change as the big things that shape this century. What characterizes them? Well, they are slowly moving, but fundamentally changing our living conditions. Slowly moving means that we don't see them changing from one day to the next and from 1 year to the next. And I remember well in the field of population projections when I first hit the headlines in the leading Austrian newspaper, the Courier, when in the year 85 has just come back with a fresh PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in demography, and did my own population projections for Austria, but were different, and at that time all statistical agencies as well as the UN assumed that all countries would converge to replacement level fertility, and they just had increased the upper ceiling of life expectancy from 75 years to 77 years, and they thought that this was very courageous to do. Well, I thought maybe the future will be different. I did some scenarios with an upper limit of 85, which from today's perspective is maybe too low, as well as fertility staying permanently below replacement level. And then I said, well, under these conditions, the current Austrian pension system would really not be sustainable. And this made the headlines, but this was doing projections for 25 to 30 when the baby boom generation that was already born at that time would retire. Well, similar model projections we are doing for climate change, and because climate change is also not happening overnight, it's slowly evolving, and but we should also now start with adaptive measures. Just Bangkok is really very high on the list of megacities that possibly could be is slowly submerging under the sea level if the sea level rises by 1 or 2 meters, as some of the more recent scenarios suggest, with a 100-year perspective, and maybe there should be some start moving the capital already to some higher lands, and slowly, in decades time, but at least you should start thinking in Bangkok about this. Now, in the climate change community, it's been very useful recently to distinguish between policies which refer to adaptation of given climate trend change that cannot be changed anymore, and mitigation. Mitigation trying to change the trends themselves. I mean, the whole Paris Agreement is about mitigation, to still reduce the CO2 emissions, to have less climate change. But some climate change is definitely going on. We'll most likely have at least between 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. But unfortunately, I think it's likely to have more like 3 or more with very heavy impacts all over the place. Now, let me just try to get this distinction to demography and the population aging. I mean, much of what we've heard from different countries is really adaptive to the climate change. It's like reforming the pension system, it's reforming the institutions. I mean, that's what also the Bank of Japan guys said, that there can be adaptations, but on the other hand, the demographic trends themselves clearly matter a lot, and I completely disagree with them that the demography is irrelevant. If I believe that, I would change my job tomorrow. And they do matter, but we have to be careful. They don't matter in a simplistic way. Now, what are the mitigative? We haven't talked too much about mitigation, but much has been implicit in our discussions. When we talk about mitigation to the megatrend of population aging, then in the first instance we have sort of the more directly demographic variables: fertility, mortality, and migration. As you all know, these are the 3 forces shaping population dynamics. Well, mortality, I don't think we want to use it as a tool to reduce aging. We don't want to increase mortality because all efforts are there to further continue decreasing mortality. There's sort of 2 other factors. And fertility, you know, in some countries in Europe, from Hungary to South Korea, this is a hot political topic. They want to really enhance, they feel that the birth rate is too low, but very, very few of these efforts to increase the birth rate have historically been successful. You may say the only country that really had consistent pro-natalist policies over more than a century, I should say, is France, and there it had resided in a relatively stable fertility around somewhat below replacement level. The other country that had sort of relatively stable high fertility were the Nordic countries with a very strong welfare system and also high gender equity. Also there we've recently seen quite unexpected drops in Finland to 1.4 and Norway to 1.5. So something is also changing there in the TFR. So we don't have time now to talk fertility. The word on migration, it has come out in several of these comments. We just finished a major study, IIASA and the European Commission's Joint Research Center. It's actually coming out next week. We have together a Center for Migration and Population Studies, where we did a lot of different scenarios. And also playing with labor force participation and the education composition of the population. So what sort of migration into Europe would have what effects on the different dependency ratios that Alexa had mentioned, and also with different definitions of age groups and also on productivity of the future. In short, what was already said in some of the comments, labor force participation is really key. We've shown, for instance, that if all the countries in the European Union would by 2030 reach the labor force participation rates that Sweden already has today, then the number of workers, the size of the labor force in Europe would not decline over time at all, despite of the massive aging of the baby boom generation. So there is really it's a multi-dimensional thing, and we should not just look at the population numbers. Okay, the last issue is mitigation on not only the head count, but also what's going on in our heads. Many of the studies that we worked over the 2 days showed clearly that education matters crucially, and it's lifelong learning that matters clearly for the onset of dementia and many of the other diseases. But we only are ready, that's what the empirical studies show, to do engage in lifelong learning if we have a good basis, if we have a good education at the beginning of our life. And the other is due to many other activities. I'm just going to mention volunteer work. Volunteer work has been shown in many aging studies, particularly in Europe and the US, to be very important for healthy aging. But the evidence also shows that people are only ready to engage in voluntary work after retirement if they started early in their life. So in that sense, one of the best investments in healthy aging in the longer term future is to give young people a better education today and try to get them engaged in voluntary work early in their life. Thank you.
Okay, Stuart, I think we should just open this up. Unless you have something that you are eager to respond to.
No.
Yeah. Okay. I like that response. Okay.
It will be different. Now, why do we need this? You also let's mention that it's sort of theoretical. I don't think it's theoretical because, you know, if probably some good example from former Soviet Union, you know, experience. In the 60s, there was a good saying that our shoes are the best in the world because we've never seen others producing them. You know, that's the same. If you're all the time are told that 65 is you are old, 65 you're old, that your conscience, it just develops that you're old, so that changes your behavior. So these type of things, they help people to understand that actually they are not old. So they are not old at age 65 or at age 60. So it also helps, you know, to promote some policies. For example, you know, increasing pension age or anyways, some policies related to aging. So that's, I think, where we have these benefits of looking a little bit different at age. So it has also practical benefits because it facilitates, you know, developing and promoting different policies.
Yes. I don't have your names down, so please forgive me.
Silvia Helbuli. So two of the interventions talk about international migration, and so I would like the presenters to reflect on the possible impact of international migration when you look it from the perspective of the sending countries, and in two aspects. One could be related to the changes in the dependency ratios. That would be a similar approach as the one that is used for receiving countries. But the other one, in this conference, we have seen how for most of the developing countries, the aging population depends on family support, economic support and care. So when you have like these large amounts of migrants leaving the countries, that probably that part is not fulfilled. No? And I think that's one of the challenges that many of the countries of origin are facing. And in terms of numbers, I mentioned yesterday that for Mexico, it's 20%, almost 20% of the working age population. For Colombia and for Venezuela, now that we're seeing this migration in the last year and a half, it's about 15% of its population, so it's not a minor issue.
Thank you.
I just want to ask in relation to Philippines, so Plenee, Castillo, you did touch upon something we haven't talked about today, which is the care workforce, and obviously with whatever you call it, aging population and long-term care needs, however you define it, there is the need for the care workforce. And actually from a source country perspective, I want you to elaborate a little bit more about the impacts of the care chain. So when women leave to go to care for other people in other countries, what happens to their own care responsibility, whether for older people or younger people. And this is a big issue that we haven't talked about, the workforce in general, and kind of provision of care and cost of informal care, etc. Thank you.
One more comment or question?
Well, listening to the discussion and then thinking back to what I said at the beginning, and I think the concept of aging, at least how we started to look at it as demographers or from the population division, looking at retirement ages, male retirement ages at age 60, and thinking now the future of work and the increased flexibilization of work, and most probably the next generations won't have the luxury of having continued employment, having a job where they go in at the age of 15 or 20 and they retire from. So we might not retire anymore. And if we don't retire anymore, the whole issue of aging, the concept of aging would change completely, because we might not draw on a pension, or we might need access to all kind of different resources. And now thinking also all these concepts we have discussed so far fit to the developed country. Most in developing countries, most people cannot afford to retire. And that is how it was also 100, 150 years ago in the developed world. So in developing countries, the informal sector is huge. And when we talk about employment, it's usually the formal employment, and also pensions in developing countries. We know often it's one payment, and it's not a monthly regular income that people have. So I think maybe it's talking about aging is a luxury we might not have in the future.
Thank you. Why don't we see if there are any responses, comments that the panel has? More comments? Stuart?
Yeah, two things. Sergey, hang on for this. This is these are just things that people say to me when I'm presenting. That's what I was saying there, right? I mean, the extraordinary power of this prospective approach is that it shows us how out of step institutions are. It shows us how we need to completely rethink our attitudes and ideas about age and chronological age, right? That's the real power of this. But then the translation of that into actually saying, right, well then this is what you actually have to do as a policy change, then that's just that next step that we need to be more deeply engaged with. I think that's like the next step. And that's where, in terms of characteristics, approaches as well, I think that's the key, is that next step. By looking at characteristics that we can drill down, I think, at the meso and micro level a little bit more, to kind of more concrete policy recommendations. I think the thing about being static, what I meant by that was like when thinking of remaining life expectancy of 15 years. Right? So it's not about meeting it's just that notion of holding that constant over time. And I mean, just on Wolfgang, it's really irritating actually. I mean, you actually said that's kind of what I was trying to say, but I made a mess of it. It's like about being reactive and proactive, of adaptation and mitigation. And of course, scenarios. The scenarios are in climate change, IPCC scenarios. I would imagine that we could have that we would have aging scenarios as well. But then that's why you're running institutes and a full professor and I'm not. So that's so famous.
What? I mean, part of what Sergey and I are doing is trying to communicate with policymakers that they need to make policies that are more flexible, that change with changing conditions. And the basic idea is sort of like what Wolfgang said in terms of mitigation. The quote that I gave from the chief economist of the Bank of Japan basically said, if you have very rigid rules and policies based on chronological age, in a world where life expectancy is changing, something will break. And the work that Sergey and I have done is to try to give people some metrics that allow them to produce flexible policies that are not rigidly based on ages in the future, but react to changes in people's characteristics. And I think perhaps that is one of the most important things that we do. we have to think about this issue of mitigation, but we have to think about it in a flexible way. We have to have policies that are proactive and reactive and change with changing conditions. And if we decide that we are going to continue down the road of having policies just based on chronological age, we will continue to have various demographic crises in pensions and healthcare and some other way. And there is a better way to do it. We have the example of Sweden. We just have to decide that we want to do it this better way. We have to ourselves understand the need for this flexibility. But once we do it, we can do it, and our work gives us a way to actually do it.
I might just make a brief comment before we get another set of questions or comments. I was particularly happy to hear Professor Jatter and Mr. Kelly talk about long-term care, because I think in many ways that's a much thornier and much knottier problem than pensions. The basic problem, first of all, there are enormous gender aspects. Governments all the way from Japan to the UK, with many others along the way, are petrified of taking over, so to speak, the care responsibilities of middle-aged women who are doing it for free. And on the private insurance front, the cost of long-term care insurance, I think we heard, is just astronomical, because insurance companies are petrified. They're costing in a 35-year-old who suffers a catastrophic accident or something is being cared for the rest of their life. Long-term care and care in general is and disability, is a really big deal in this whole area. A second set of interventions, please. Yes, from World Health Organization. That much I do remember.
Thank you very much, and great to have a session where we can think about recommendations. I appreciated what Stuart laid out at the beginning in terms of trying to come up with some criteria to select measures. And I thought that was good advice, that we should be clear on what it is that we want to communicate. And you had a series of other issues that you raised. I would like to add that, given the complexity of indicators, that we're clear on what is it that's person-centered, that could summarize. And if I would prefer we don't just take life expectancy, whether it's this moving projection perspective, but some adjustment that, for example, healthy life expectancy at 60, 65, 70, we can calculate it at any different age in terms of the expectation. But I do think it's important we think of that adjustment, because so much of what we're talking about in terms of gaining that potential is if people's capacities enable them to. And I think what Carol's presentation earlier today on care dependence reminded us of the severe end of the spectrum, but a healthy life expectancy adjustment that considers capacities on the continuum would be able to summarize not just that severe end, but the whole spectrum. I also appreciated the suggestion from the climate change that Wolfgang mentioned, in terms of if we think of capacity side as how as individuals we adapt, we then consider what's the mitigation in terms of the environment around us. And that's very much the model of functional ability that WHO is promoting. Certainly, we're thinking not just about the health sector, but we're thinking much broader in terms of all the other systems and determinants. And that may, some kind of framework like that could be helpful so that we're not mixing long-term care and healthy life expectancy in the same box. And I think as you elaborate that, maybe you already have, but it should be clear that what are the person-centered outcome measures, and then what are the range of contributors. And just one more comment. On the prospective presentation that was given yesterday morning, I just had one question about the criteria that was mentioned on why it was, or an assessment of why it was considered good. And maybe I misunderstood, so it's a question. And that was that it's good because when we look at it, it's now the projection is that aging is actually not happening. It's more flat in terms of this change of the structure and how it was. And I'm thinking about some of the ministers that we have conversations with. And if I showed him or her that, oh look, this is kind of flat, they're going to think, oh, then it's not a problem. And it's not about the tsunami, but it's what's the reaction. And I think this comes back to what Stuart said. What are you trying to communicate? And we may not have one measure, but I'm a little concerned that if that was a key summary measure, it would get attention. And we just have to consider, if we're only going to have one key thing from demographers, is that the one? And let's think about the criteria and the complexity of the message. Thanks.
Yes, please.
So my name is Patricia, and thank you all very much for your presentations. Perhaps following on, first of all, from what Ritu has said in terms of person-centered measurement, that resonates with me because when we speak about long-term care, and I really agree with you, it's an incredibly thorny issue. One of the discussions we have with my colleagues in HelpAge is actually, when we're talking about long-term care, what then are we saying about older people in need of long-term care? And are we speaking sufficiently about long-term care and support for independence, understood as being in accordance with my will and preferences? So even though I may have a very high level of physical dependence, that my independence in that psychological and cultural sense is maintained and understood. So I think I say that simply in terms of adding into this discussion around person-centered measurement. I think it was Stuart who spoke about, was it Stuart or Warren who spoke about translating for governments? One of you. And again, I think it links back to what Ritu was saying. And I find myself thinking, right, in terms of that translation to government, what part of the message is about government accountability and how governments will be held accountable in terms of their populations and populations understanding? So that's a question that that's going through my mind as we're having the conversation. And then going back to the point about Japan and the treasury or the finance official, I suppose the sense I have that peer-to-peer learning, wherever we are, is hugely valuable. So government-to-government exchange and civil servant-to-civil servant exchange around where these changes have been made, or for example in Sweden, could be very valuable in terms of this process. So there are observations rather than a specific question. Thank you very much.
Yes, please.
Wasana from UNDESA. I appreciate this concluding session, particularly on recommendations that all panelists suggest here. My issue is really related to, we talk a lot about human capital development, and I like that Professor Lutz did mention that we need to invest more in education. Yet we are facing some dilemma in the sense that when we are talking about proper education or higher education, that doesn't translate into less employment. I'm taking the issue in the case in Thailand as well. even though we have low unemployment rate, 1-2% overall, but yet when you look at need, no education, employment and training among young people in this country is around 16%, and we are talking about 2-3 rounds of data collection. And we're also facing the problem that educational institutions produce the graduates who do not meet the demand of the markets. For example, in this country, we have a large number of graduates, newly graduate students, who graduate in social science, but yet we are talking about those who are in demand of other section. So we are talking about mismatch of this kind of producing people in younger generation. Again, I'm thinking that when we're talking about aging, we also need to look at how to really support and enhance capacity and productivity of people in younger generation. That's my first comment, observation. And the second one I'm thinking about in terms of policy planners. Oftentimes we're talking about the role of the central government, but yet in the context of leaving no one behind, I just think that we also need to pay attention at local government, decentralization. Again, take Thailand for example. Bangkok is a very big city compared to the rest of the country, but yet the policy that we have in the country cannot apply or applicable to other provinces. For example, let's take the province from, in the north, in which we have a high number of ethnic groups, for example. Access to, social protection, access to welfare and all that may not be similar to what you see at the country level. So there's two issues in terms of the role of local governments and evidence and policy support, and second one about the employment, decent employment. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you again to the speakers, and I just thought I'd give my 2 cents on just the concluding aspects of the forum itself. Right? So when I'm just thinking back to the objective of the 2-day meeting where we're reaching research and policy, I just thought a simplified way of me understanding and taking it back home is really how can I salute the research, the wide scope of existing research on the subject of population aging, measurements and all that. But I thought, why don't we stop and rechurn our energy from a more bottom-up approach where the specifications is drawn from the ground or realities, and then those specifications further inform a much urgent need to actually crop a more systematic, maybe classified matrix, because I thought that when we're addressing aging, it's actually addressed in layers, and they're very unique. So those things needs to be further broken down, because at the end of the day, it's about addressing the mass older persons that are still vulnerable. So I thought that classification is a big work in itself, and perhaps research can actually zoom into those classifications, because at the end of the day, it would be very nice to have a very simple document where classifications are very, you can relate to it. And perhaps, okay, Fiji, you are at this classifications, and perhaps if you're wanting to go a layer up from there, you could probably tap on these interventions that are probably contextualized to suit your interventions as such a time as this.
Do we have any responses? And then before we turn it back to the audience, I might have something to put on the table.
Thank you. Just on this last point, I think this is a very important general point that, in reality, there's a mutual back and forth between the concept that we have in our mind, and including the concept of aging and how we measure aging, and then the needs that we see on the ground. Because our perception is shaped by our concept. On the other hand, what we see on the ground needs can help us to modify our concept. So it's really a back and forth in the policies. You cannot just do policies, or any human behavior is always shaped by the concepts we have in mind. And maybe just another comment, it's a complex story about the education. Of course, what I'm talking is very general, sort of enhancement of cognitive capacities in a generic sense. which is different from a specific school system that may, at a higher level, produce skills that are not needed on the job market. But we are not only learning and enhancing our cognitive skills for the job market, also this is important, but just coming back also to Ritu's point about this intrinsic capacity. And this is really something, I mean, there's so many positive aspects of education outside our economic employment, for our health behavior, for the time horizon that we have in planning and whether we choose a healthy lifestyle or not, for our capacity for social networking and learning. And this is really sort of the last two examples that I've made. So the one is really the intrinsic capacity that has to do also with our cognitive skills and the onset of dementia. So, and the other, what I gave the example of volunteer work, that's really sort of the societal empowerment. So I think this WHO concept of functional capacity as the intrinsic is really very useful in this context. Finally, I think we still owe Sylvia an answer on the migration, which is of course a very complex one. It's also linked to the long-term need issue because we, at the moment, Western Europe as well as many other countries are really being able to deal with the long-term care because we have immigrant care workers, be there from Eastern Europe or from the Philippines, we heard of this example. And at the moment, this fund, because of the non-simultaneity of the demographic transition and economic development in different countries of the world. But this may not last forever. I mean, these extending countries now, first of all, they are deprived of some of their human capital. And I mean, there's lots of discussion in the migration community. Maybe circular migration is a solution that they do not come forever, but they come back home, bring some money plus some additional skills back home. But this is clearly an issue on the table.
Or Stuart?
Well, just to come to Patricia and Ritu's question, I'm very glad that you asked that because I actually think that this characteristics approach to aging fundamentally is person-centered. I think that is a big move away from where we used to be, which was based on some kind of general number or some characterization of being old or young, dependent, not dependent, of being 65 or 60. I think that, and particularly if we're thinking about demand for particular services, it's going to have much more to do with your pampering or your education or the life that you've had or your job rather than your age. And I think that's fundamentally at the heart of this characteristics approach to aging. I think it fundamentally is person-centered. Now, whether or not we've got it down on how we deal with the micro and macro operationalization of this is a different question, but I think that we've made, I would say that in this conceptualization, we've made a quantum leap has been made in terms of how we are actually conceptualizing the relationship between age and institutions, demand, services, whatever it is.
Okay. I'd like to also comment on what Ritu said, which is the characteristics approach takes into account that people have many characteristics, not just their remaining life expectancy. And it's important to deal with people in this multi-dimensional framework. So I don't want to say, we have this one version of this measure, and that's it. We have to realize that we have to look at disabilities, we have to look at people's functioning, all these different things can be translated into these characteristic ages. They could be then merged because they're all measured in a common metric. And it's one way of thinking about people in a complex, multi-dimensional way. So the reason that this is good is that it allows us to think about people in this multi-dimensional framework, not because it shows that aging is faster or slower. It recognizes that we have to think about people in terms of people's characteristics, how they function, what their abilities are, all these different dimensions. And that is what's really sort of crucial and what the advantage of what we did. We can take all these different dimensions and measure them in a common metric so we can have a consistent multi-dimensional view of aging. me just say one thing about Fiji. It's important to realize that if you want the UN or somebody else, the WHO, to tell you something about where Fiji is in terms of aging, in context of the world, it depends on which measures of aging you use. And we are no longer in this world. That's what we want to say in this conference. We're no longer in this world where there's one way only of thinking about aging. So if we say, okay, where does Fiji fit in the worldwide context of aging, we have to first say, how do we think about aging? So that's an important question. And I think that when we do these international comparisons, we now need to take this into account. Thank you.
If I sort of respond to those, I can't understand your hand language. You want to say something, second?
Question to both of us. I mean, how the trends, they are sort of going down, and how the ministries or whatever, it's difficult then for them to get sort of attention to the issue. And I just want to comment on that. That basically what we are doing, maybe in a very simple way. Certain trends which I was showing yesterday are coming down. Basically, what we are trying to do, we are trying to clean real stuff from an age inflation. That's what we are trying to do. Because if there is something real, you will still have it. Like, if you look what's happening in this next 50 years, still, there are many countries where you still have aging, but they are clean from age inflation. That's what we are doing.
I can throw something out, or if there's someone who has something they want to say. We're running a bit over, but I'm sure that you'll grant us 10 minutes or so. We are running a bit over. Both of you had something. Ben, you had something, and no.
Just put it really say.
I want to go back to how we use these different. I want to go back to how we use these different indices, and I think the old age dependency ratio is just wrong and offensive in an extraordinary number of ways. Its definition of old age, its definition of dependency, so it's very ill-conceived. I think the alternative measures we've got here are better because they try and change that channel I was referring to, which is that how our aging is changing. There does seem to be a difference between the two, though. The classic old age dependency ratio was intended to say, here's a problem, you've got to react to it. I think what you get from these alternative measures are, wow, how do we make the most of that, or what do we do about it? So one says, this is the problem you've got. This new one says, how do we respond? What should we do about it? And that seems to be a very big difference in terms of those two things.
Yes.
Thank you. Just following on from what Sergey was saying, and I'm just perhaps trying to reframe where the discussion's been leading just now, that what we're really trying to do is refocus the policy discussion around ageing away from the chronological age macroeconomic scare towards what needs to happen for individuals to experience aging well. So by using the prospective age dependency or similar new measures to say that the demographic age structure shift is not an issue we need to be focusing on, then maybe we can focus instead on other measures of how well countries are dealing with ageing in terms of the unmet need for care and support for this vulnerable group of people. So it's not about how many of them are there, it's about what needs they have and how they're being met. So then you have a completely different ranking of countries in terms of their problem of dealing with ageing, because it's the problem of those unmet needs.
Yes. And then we better go back to that.
Just one reflection on the kind of discussion and prospective ages is very good. However, we need to rule a country where there is no much data to look at the unmet need of care and the healthy life expectancy and the types of diseases that are there. There's some countries with no data for older people at all. So actually, if you turn to a new measure, you will give one piece of information and not the bigger picture. And from policy perspective, then you're not achieving what you want to achieve from person-centered or from policies that tailor to meet the needs of certain groups. So I think this is just something to think about of which measure to use in which context. And it could be very useful, and I can see how it is useful in Europe, for example, and when you have loads and loads of data to unpick different things across cohorts and across groups of people. But when you deal with dearth of data, and I'm talking about deserts, no data, no information, and you want to push policy forward and then start the discussion and work on your qualitative and consultative work, then from my point of view, working with chronological age is a step towards that. Then maybe in a few years when you mobilize and understand more about the data, then you go and unpick different things. Thank you.
I think in view of the time of what we ought to, I'm sorry to shorten this somewhat, I think we ought to turn the floor over to you, Sergei, who I guess for the organizer, and perhaps you, Warren, to say, and also the UNDESA, to say a word or two of closing and thank our hosts.
No more long speeches, and I think I just would like to thank each and every one. And yes, I also want to mention a few names because I think there are a couple of people who are in the room, who are outside the room, who really make this happen. And I first of all, of course, would like to thank the country of Thailand, the city of Bangkok, the university, the Center of Population Studies, and now I get to mention some names. Waipan, 13, and if I got it right, it is Ice and Yot. I think these two really worked very hard from the Chula side, and everybody else who was running around the room, and I would not know the names, but all the students, from the ones who helped us with the microphones, who did the traditional music, the concert last night, and I think it was absolutely fantastic. We felt so warmly welcome, and it makes a difference. It makes or breaks a meeting if you feel welcome, if you feel comfortable, if you feel the warmth and the really welcome from the heart. So I really want to express our sincere gratitude. Then, of course, this could not have happened if we would not have worked so closely with our colleagues and friends from IIASA, and it was an extremely productive relationship, I think. And I've had, it's now, I would say 15 years ago, I organized also in collaboration with the university a regional conference on aging, and that was also a fantastic relationship. We worked long, and I say it's the same thing now this time with IIASA. And is it aging? Is it really, when you work on aging, you have the people in the room who are really committed to the topic. It's not people who come in, what is in there for me? I think people who come and say, what is in there for us? What's in there for our future? And I think that has really been translated into a wonderful outcome. And I do look forward to continued discussions we're gonna have, even if we leave and go back to our places. Then of course, this meeting could not have happened without each of you traveling, as I said at the beginning, from very far, spending hours, losing luggage, not giving up hope, being here, in spite of being jet lagged, being there, and I find it amazing. Sometimes you have these meetings the first day in the late afternoon, people fall asleep, they're tired, the presence fades out, people go shopping, people go sightseeing, the second day in the morning, half the room is empty, and I must say I'm absolutely amazed. We have everybody in the room, and of course people who are from here have other commitments, and whoever travels has other business, has other meetings to do. But I would say it was an absolutely fantastic experience. We all learned a lot. I think we go home with more questions than answers, but sometimes the questions are the answers, and that make us think more, think deeper, revisit the topic we thought we have it all sorted out. So I really want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
I also want to thank all of you because you made this meeting, I hope, a success. I met people from very different backgrounds, and I think that would make it really, really very interesting. Of course, I want to thank Chula, CPS. CPS, because I work with them for many, many years, they're organizing the courses, and everything is absolutely amazing. Of course, Ipan, they just work, working very, very hard, and the whole CPS is working very hard. So they were sitting the day before everything started, up to very, very late, packing all this, our folders, and just everything is so great. So thank you very much. Of course, I want to thank Caroline, because we really work very close, very nice. Sandrine and Tim, who is unfortunately not here, but not Sandrine, of course. And I said, the team who was unfortunately not capable of coming here, for many reasons, but we just really, such a nice collaboration, and just, I think I will be missing after this meeting, this sort of daily, emailing, Skype talks and all that. And from the other side, I think this show will never run without Stuart. Because I mean, he 99.9% of responsibilities. So thank you so much, and I hope that this was a fun meeting for everyone.
Deepan?
Supporting this meeting, and I also would like to thank UNDESA Population Commission for support this meeting also. And I also would like to give my special thanks to Stephanie and COVID and Dr. Ice and Dr. Yod, who have been working so hard to put logistic together. I also would like to thank all CPS staff members for working behind the scenes. And now it's come to the end of the meeting, and we have learned that most of us are still young or in middle age, by definition of prospective age. So we will have many years to work together on aging issues. Last but not least, I hope that you will have some time to enjoy pleasurable things that Bangkok and Thailand is offering.
And stand up, please. And thank you very much for your participation.